Hello everyone, and welcome to today's webinar on setting a science-based target for the IT sector. Before we get started, I would like to go over a few items so you know how to participate in today's webinar. You've joined the presentation listening using your computer speaker system by default. If you would prefer to join over the telephone, just select telephone in the audio pane and the dial-in information will be displayed. You will have the opportunity to submit your questions to today's presenters by typing your questions into the questions pane of the control panel on the right-hand side of your screen. You can send in your questions at any time during the presentation, and we will collect these and address them during the Q&A session at the end or afterwards via email. I would now like to introduce today's first presenter, Amy Collins from the UN Global Compact Network, UK.
Good morning, everyone, and welcome to this webinar on raising business ambition for 1.5 degrees, setting a science-based target for the IT sector. So this webinar is hosted by the UN Global Compact Network UK and the Carbon Trust. And we really appreciate you all joining this morning and hope that you are all safe and well. Next slide, please. So my name is Amy Collins and I lead on the climate programme here at the UN Global Compact Network UK. And I'm very pleased to be joined today by three other speakers. So we have Andy Stevens, who is the Associate Director of Carbon Trust, and he will be taking us through the steps for setting a science-based target for the IT sector. I'm also very pleased to welcome our guest speakers, Gabrielle Ginér, who is the Head of Sustainability at BT, and she will be sharing her company insights on setting a science-based target, as well as Alexander Farsan from the Science Based Targets Initiative, who will be telling us a bit about that initiative. Next slide, please. So briefly, for those of you who are not familiar with the UN Global Compact, it is the world's largest corporate sustainability initiative, and it's made up of around 10,000 companies worldwide that have made a commitment to our 10 universal principles, which are drawn from UN treaties. So these cover human rights, labour, environment, and anti-corruption. And our work covers a broad remit to advance these principles around the world. So it also enhances the SDGs by driving business action to support achievement of them. And at the moment, as I'm sure you all are, we're striving to effectively respond to the COVID-19 crisis. And currently the UN Global Compact is offering a fantastic webinar series, which has had leading speakers from various sectors and from throughout the UN as well, talk about their response to the crisis. So it's touched on the challenges of the crisis, but it's also been shining a light on the positives and opportunities that could come out of this, which is really refreshing to hear at this time. So I really urge you to tune in to those there every Tuesday. Next slide, please. So we're really delighted to be working with the Carbon Trust in this to deliver this webinar series on science-based targets for different sectors. This is the second in the series, and we have a number more still to go over the next 2 months. Next slide, please. Finally, I just want to raise awareness of the Business Ambition for 1.5 Degree campaign. So this is an urgent call to action led by the Science Based Targets Initiative in partnership with UN Global Compact and the We Mean Business Coalition. And it calls on companies to sign up and commit to the most ambitious aim of the Paris Agreement by setting a science-based target that aligns with 1.5 degrees. So recently an update was made to the commitment letter for companies to commit to either setting targets aligned to 1.5 degrees for scope 1, 2 and 3, or setting a target to reach net zero by 2050 with science-based targets aligned to either 1.5 or well below 2 degrees. And this commitment letter demonstrates and is emphasizing companies who've sought the highest level of climate ambition, and it's really calling on others to do so. And I'm sure many of you have seen that in the news recently, governments are being urged to harness their economic recovery plans to encourage low carbon activities and industries in the wake of the COVID-19 situation. And it's likely that this year there will be a reduction in carbon emissions of around 5.5%, which is of course, really fantastic, but unfortunately, it's not enough if we're going to keep warming to 1.5 degrees. So as much as the changes we've seen over the last few weeks have had an impact, we're still going to need to do a lot more to limit the effects of climate change. And hopefully part of that is the rigor that the science-based targets bring. So with that, I just want to say thank you very much, and I'll hand over to Andy now.
Hi, it's Andy Stevens. I lead the work with the Carbon Trust for the ICT sector. And so I'm initially a very quick introduction to the Carbon Trust and then some background on climate science and why we need to set science-based targets. So the Carbon Trust is a non-profit organisation working with governments and companies on helping them reduce their emissions and moving to a low carbon economy. We've been in existence for nearly 20 years now. I've got a worldwide team of employees, sort of experts in carbon measurement, in carbon strategy, and as I say, working with both companies and with government and other public sectors in the carbon space. And very recently, we've worked with quite a lot of companies on helping them to set science-based targets and have sort of quite a lot of experience. So here's a selection of some of the ones that we've been working with who have already set targets. We're also in the process of working with quite a number of other companies at the moment who are in the process of doing that and will announce more targets soon. So overall, we've worked with about 85 companies globally on setting science-based targets. So what we hope you'll get out of this webinar is to sort of understand what science-based targets is about, specifically the requirements for the ICT sector, and introduction to what the key requirements are for the Science-Based Target Initiative for submitting a science-based target, and why you should be doing this, so what's the benefit for it, and some sort of practical tips and experience from BT who've been through the process and some sort of support. And as Maddie mentioned at the beginning, if you do have questions, then if you put them in the question box, and Maddie will sort of collate those, and we'll hopefully have a time for some questions at the end of the seminar. So climate science, I mean, the key thing, and most of the people on this call will be very much aware of this, but the temperature has been rising significantly due to increased greenhouse gas emissions. There's a lot of evidence. This is sort of one chart from the Met Office showing the overall global average temperature, which has risen by about 1 degree centigrade now since pre-industrial times. And the concern is sort of how do we sort of stop that happening, mitigate the impacts of climate change in the future. And so again, you'll all be familiar with the Paris Agreement from 2015, which set international ambition for governments to keep global average temperature well below 2 degrees and to pursue efforts to limit this to 1.5 degrees. So at that time, there was limited information about 1.5 degree pathway, and on the basis of that, the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, published a sort of detailed scientific review of the science around what was needed to keep global warming temperature below 1.5 degrees centigrade. And why is 2 degrees and 1.5 degrees important? Well, the chart here, which is from Climate Action Tracker, shows sort of projected increases in global temperature out to the end of the century. So the grey plume is sort of what would happen as business as usual if no different policies were implemented. That means temperature would rise to nearly 5 degrees Celsius. The current policies, so government policies, lead to a temperature rise of between like 3 and 3.5 degrees. And then the current pledges and targets by governments are nowhere near enough to meet 2 degrees or 1.5 degrees. And obviously, as the temperature increases, the impacts on society and on the globe magnified, and will completely. We obviously at the moment very much aware of the impact that COVID-19 has had on the global economy and our way of working, and climate change can bring much bigger impacts on society. So it's imperative to reduce emissions. And the lines at the bottom, the green and the yellow, are what are needed to keep below 2 degrees and 1.5 degrees. So we're well off what's needed. And so the idea of science-based targets is to provide targets that companies and governments can set, which are in line with the latest climate science, to keep below 2 degrees and to hit the 1.5 degree target. And why is it important for companies to do this? So this is results from a poll for a YouGov survey of 185 companies, which was commissioned by the Science Based Target Initiative, showing why companies see it as important. So there's some which is about their sort of reputation and being sort of recognised as leaders and doing the right thing. But there's also driving for the business. It's driving innovation. It's boosting investor confidence. So investors will recognise that companies that are setting science-based targets are following the best practice in terms of climate action. So there's a number of positive reasons why companies should take part in this. And with that, I'll lead on to introducing Alex Farsan from the SBTI to introduce the Science-Based Target Initiative in a bit more detail.
Great, thanks very much, Andy. And thanks everybody for giving us some of your time today. I'll quickly talk about the institutions behind science-based targets. There have been some companies that were pioneers and actually engaged around science-based targets before. Gabrielle can maybe tell you a bit more about this. But the Science-Based Targets Initiative really is what I think popularized the idea. And we're a partnership between 4 organizations: the CDP, the UN Global Compact, who kindly hosts today's webinar, the World Resources Institute, and WWF, where I'm based. And the idea is that we want to promote science-based targets as standard business practice. So the vision really is that ultimately all businesses around the world will have climate strategies that are aligned with science and that contribute to the global net zero transition that we need, as Andy has set out just now. And we really do so with a number of different strategies. So first of all, and perhaps most prominently, we develop methods and guidance and tools and criteria for what it means to have a science-based target. So we translate this complex climate science from the IPCC and other sources down to the level of a company. What does it mean for an individual company to follow this guidance from climate science? We then promote science-based targets to companies as a powerful tool to, on the one hand, future-proof your growth in the low-carbon transition, and on the other hand, understanding how much is enough. So really getting a sense of not how much can we incrementally change over the next years, but what do we need to aim to, really lifting your gaze towards the horizon and understanding this is where we need to get to contribute our fair share to this transition that we know that we need. But we also promote science-based targets with a number of other stakeholders. Prominently, we speak a lot to investors that want to understand whether their companies that they have invested in or they're lending to are actually transitioning and recognize the risks, the transition risks of this low carbon transition. And we work with regulators of helping them understand how science-based targets can fit into their decarbonization plans. For example, the Japanese Ministry of Environment has actually set explicitly for themselves a target of approved companies within Japan by the end of 2020. And finally, we try to promote it through global supply chains. So science-based targets obviously recognize that the impact of a company is not just limited to its operations, but its influence across its entire value chain. And we do ask companies to set targets for these and thereby spread this idea and the ambition of science-based targets through global supply and value chains. And finally, we have an independent assurance mechanism. We validate companies' targets against these criteria that we have set out for what it means to have a science-based target. And that's a relatively simple process. Companies can follow the guidance and the methods to set these targets, and they submit them to the Science-Based Targets Initiative, and then get an assessment of whether or not their targets actually do meet the requirements that we've set out, and will then be highlighted on our website and those of our partners at companies that are taking climate action in line with science. Next slide, please. And it's a growing global movement. We have now over 870 companies that have joined the Science-Based Targets Initiative, so that have either publicly committed to setting a science-based targets within 2 years, or have already had their targets approved. And those are over 360 companies that have already had their targets approved. And as you can see, if you blink, you're already seeing that we're starting to move into a exponential growth phase, really. And over the past 6 months or so, we've had over 30 companies join per month, so one company every day. And this includes so many of the largest companies in the world that have recognized that this is part of their responsibility as a business, but also understand that this is a smart business to plan for the future. Very rarely do you get to see a disruption from as far away as the climate crisis. So planning for this really is just prudent business strategy. And if you want to know more about the SBTI and the progress that we've made in making science-based targets standard business practice, we would recommend you to go to our website, where we have a report called Raising the Bar that really summarizes the SBTI's approach to this challenge and sets out where we've made progress, and also has a lot of interesting case studies that highlight how companies are taking action and how they see the benefits from those targets. That's already it for me. I'll hand over back to Andy. Again, thank you for joining, and we look forward to many of you joining the SBTI in the future.
Hello, yeah, so it's Andy Stevens here again. I'm now going to go through the specific SBT criteria for the ICT sector, and a little bit of background on that and how that was developed and how it applies to companies. So, I mean, of those companies that Axel just sort of pointed out that have set targets or are looking at setting targets, there is a significant number that already have set targets within the ICT sector, and it's sort of quite encouraging. And on the right hand, the box in the green highlight, those are the ones that have set science-based targets in the last year. So it's both quite a long history and a sort of increasing commitment, and also the pledge that Amy mentioned at the beginning. A lot of ICT companies have also signed up to that in the last 6 months and the beginning of this year. So it's sort of quite a critical area, and it's a well-supported area within the ICT sector. So a little bit of background again. I would think most people are reasonably familiar with the greenhouse gas protocol division into Scope 1, Scope 2, and Scope 3, but just to refresh that, and as it's important for the context of how science-based targets are set. So Scope 1 and 2 emissions are direct emissions from a company. So either sort of burning fuels, either sort of gas for heating or fuel for vehicles, the main ones. And Scope 2 are purchases of electricity and any other energy like steam or heating and cooling. So those are sort of the emissions that are sort of, if you like, within the direct control of a company. And then Scope 3 is everything else that the company impacts, both upstream and downstream. And the greenhouse gas protocol divides that into 15 different Scope 3 categories, which you'll see there. And we've highlighted the two purchase goods and services and use of sold products, which are the two scope 3 categories, which are probably for most ICT companies going to be the most significant. So purchase goods and services is basically the supply chain, so everything that you as a company buy and all the emissions associated with that supply chain. And then use of sold products is the energy used, consumed from the products that you sell as a company. So again, for a lot of IT companies, it depends, say, well, where in the sector specifically you are, but if it's a company which is either selling equipment or manufacturing equipment and making equipment, the life of that product is using electricity. So whether it's telecoms network equipment, servers, routers, mobile phones, or whether you're an operator who's selling on that equipment to your customers, that's going to be a significant part. And then there's a whole range of others, but those are probably the two that for a lot of ICT companies are going to be the most significant. So, and again, within the ICT sector, this is possibly a slightly confusing slide, but it's meant to show that so the ICT sector is not homogeneous. It's a mixture of software suppliers, hardware suppliers, telecoms operators, data center operators, manufacturers, and obviously the end users themselves. So what this is showing is that some companies scope 1 and 2 emissions will be another company's scope 3 and vice versa. And so there's quite an interplay between how the companies within the ICT sector operate, and that sort of makes it sort of partly unique and provides some sort of specific challenges. And so within the Science-Based Target Initiative, there are a number of sector-specific approaches that have been developed by the Science-Based Target Initiative. And those sort of primarily sort of focus on sort of high emitting areas like steel, cement, aluminium, transport, where there are specific requirements around reducing the emissions and also specific challenges. So the ICT sector, although it has quite a broad reach, is relatively small in terms of total emissions, about 2% of global emissions, but still sort of significant. But there wasn't a specific sectorial approach for the ICT sector to recognise its sort of specific nature. And the other approaches that have been developed used primarily the International Energy Agency forecasts of energy consumption. And because the ICT sector is quite smaller in terms of energy and greenhouse gas emissions, it doesn't have a separate sector data within the IEA data. So through a collaboration over the last year, throughout 2019, the three organizations, the ITU, the GSMA and GESI, got together to develop a sector-specific approach for the ICT sector. So, and the Carbon Trust was involved in supporting this on a technical basis, supporting the GSMA. And so these three organizations pulled together their memberships and developed basically a sector pathway, decarbonisation pathway for the sector. And the guidance for this was approved by the Science-Based Target Initiative at the beginning of this year and published in February. And on the top right is the guidance document. And that's available on all of these organizations' websites, and also the GSMA have developed also in March a more hands-on, step-by-step guide for ICT companies wanting to set science-based targets. So what was behind that sector pathway? There was a sort of lot of research which was pulled together and review of that, and the pathways are divided into these separate subsectors. So mobile telecoms, fixed telecoms, data centers, and ICT equipment manufacturers. And these were seen as probably the main subsectors for the ICT sector, and each have sort of quite different challenges and different opportunities to decarbonize, which is why they were separated out. And this work was pulled together and published by the ITU again earlier this year, and the document is references L1470, which is basic global emissions trajectories for the ICT sector. And the important thing is that this was developed specifically to be aligned with the Paris Agreement with a 1.5 degree trajectory. So footnote there, the ICT equipment manufacturers subsector was included in that L1470 document, but there's some more work needed to do on that to get it into the science-based target approach, and that work is ongoing and will be added later in this year. So what does the trajectories look like? So this is the chart. So we've got the top line is the total ICT sector and greenhouse gas emissions with a baseline of 2015 going out to 2030. And then the subsectors we mentioned before, user devices, data centers, mobile networks, and fixed networks. And these were based on detailed bottom-up research data to create the 2015 baseline, and that's quite challenging because it's very disparate, and there's some cases conflicting data around what is the exact energy use and emissions of the sector. The projections were done based on assumptions around energy out to 2030, so that looked at things like technology changes. So, for example, in mobile networks, the rollout of 5G and the switch off of older technologies, sort of energy efficiency improvements that we've seen in terms of computing power and other sort of energy efficiency, and also projections in terms of sort of migration from desktops to laptops to tablets, which are all reducing emissions for user devices. So a lot of sort of detailed projections together to create this forecast out to 2030. And the assumptions around the electricity, which is obviously key for this sector because electric use is the major contributor to the greenhouse gas emissions. So that gives that assumption around that was that electricity would decarbonize in line with a 1.5 degree trajectory. So this is a sort of very ambitious target, and then it was also checked against some other 1.5 degree scenarios to make sure it was compatible. The IPCC 1.5 degree P2 scenario, Science-Based Target Initiative's own absolute reduction scenario, which proposes a 42% reduction over 10 years. And then a scenario that we looked at, assuming that ICT maintains a fixed share of global electricity usage. Using that, we could use the IEA data scenarios. So a fairly robust process, and also a sort of consultations, say, through the different organizations involved to come up with these trajectories, which were then published in the ITU L.1470 document. And then the next stage is to take those trajectories and convert them into what does that mean for an individual company. So these are sort of global trajectories for the sector. And this next slide is showing how that equates for the three areas of data centers, mobile and fixed networks, that were included in the February issue of the guidance. So you see those reductions there and the overall percentage reductions. So around sort of 45% for mobile networks, 62% for fixed networks, and 53% for data centers over a 10-year period from 2020 to 2030. And these apply to the company's scope 1 and 2 targets. So that's consistent with the other sectorial science-based target approaches, that there's a specific approach which looks at the company's scope 1 and 2 emissions. And these will be achieved by companies sort of largely through a mixture of energy efficiency, but also in increased use of renewables, so decarbonisation of the grid, but also companies purchasing electricity usage. And for all of the three identified here, data centres and network operators, one of their biggest sort of part of their scope 1 and 2 emissions is the electricity usage of their own operations. So that's basically the targets, and in the guidance document, the trajectories are shown here are also in a table of factors, so you can pick your base year and your target year, and it will show you what the reduction will be over that specific period of time. And deliberately, the forecast was only done out to 2030, so following targets in the ICT sector requires just using a target out to 2030. And then applying this to a company, some very sort of simple steps, selecting the base year and the target year, allocating the scope 1 and 2 emissions to the relevant subsector. So this is sort of slightly different from other sectors because we've divided into subsectors. A company, so some might just operate in one area, like a data center operator, but a lot of telecoms companies have a combination of fixed and mobile networks, so they need to separate out their emissions between those. It's a relatively simple approach to do that. And then to calculate the target for based on the base year and target year that's been selected, and using the reduction percentages from the previous chart to calculate the scope 1 and 2 emissions for the target year. And that's done at each subsector and then added up to get the overall science-based target for the company. And then the scope 3 targets I'll cover briefly in a couple of slides. That's for the ICT sector, there's no specific additional guidance around scope 3, so that's following the existing science-based target initiative guidance, which applies to all companies for scope 3 target setting. So the process is actually relatively simple, but this just emphasizes a lot of sort of thought and analysis gone behind coming up with those trajectories. And just for completeness, I mentioned sort of other sectorial approaches and the absolute approach. So these are standard science-based target initiative approaches for companies. So an ICT company could apply these, but obviously the ICT approach has been developed specifically for the ICT sector. But just for completeness, to show that these are here. I won't go into the details of those, but they, again, are aligned with either a 1.5 degree or a well below 2 degree target. And then the scope 3 part, as I say, so this is the standard approach that the SBTi require for setting a scope 3 target. So the first thing is that if you have to measure your scope 3 emissions, and if they are 40% or more of your total scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions, then you are required to set a scope 3 target. And for most ICT companies, then it's very likely that will be the case. And then you need to set a scope 3 target, which needs to cover at least 2/3 of your total scope 3 emissions. And a sort of very quick summary of how the scope 3 target can be made up. There's some different options that the SBTi lays out. So you can have an absolute reduction target. So simply an absolute percentage reduction for the target year, which needs to be aligned to below 2 degrees Celsius. You can have an economic or physical intensity target. So that could be aligned to an economic metric or a physical metric. those tend to be more stringent than the absolute reduction target because there's sort of uncertainty around those intensity targets as to how the physical metrics might change over time. And the other approach is to set a supplier and/or a customer engagement target. So you can set a target to work with your suppliers that they will in turn set targets. And that is valid for covering your upstream supply chain emissions. And again, the number of suppliers that are covered needs to make sure that you meet the 2/3 criteria for the total of your Scope 3 emissions. And also you can set a combination. So you could set a supplier engagement target for your upstream emissions, and you could set an absolute reduction target for your downstream use of sold products. And as we mentioned earlier, that for most ICT companies, sort of by far the significant categories are likely to be the category 1 purchase goods and services and category 11 use of sold products. So that sort of concludes the summary of the details of how you set a science-based target and the specifics for the ICT sector. So I'm now going to hand over to Gabrielle Ginér at BT, who's going to take us through what they've been doing and also the process they went through to set their target, which was a few years ago, so before some of these criteria existed in Science-Based Target Initiative, and we worked with BT on helping them develop those targets.
That's great. Thank you very much, Andy, and good morning, everybody. Thanks for joining us today. Andy, if you could go to the first timeline slide, please. So at BT, we have a long history in this space. We've been taking climate action for over 25 years now. We set our first carbon reduction target already back in 1992. We were one of the first companies in the world to do so. In 2008, we set our first science-based target. And that was, of course, before anyone was really talking about these types of targets. And we thought it was going to be a great idea, but it didn't really take off at the time. If we look at the center box in this slide, in 2013, we set a net good target to help customers reduce their carbon emissions by at least 3 times the end-to-end carbon impact of our business by 2020. And we call this our 3-to-1 target. So this is a ratio where in the 3, we add up the emission savings from services like video conferencing and vehicle telematics, services that drive efficiencies, productivity, and cut carbon. And in the 1 part of the ratio, we include emissions from our own operations, those associated with our supply chain, and those from customers using our products and services. When we launched this target in 2013, we were at a ratio of just over 1-to-1. And right now we're at 2.6 to 1. The revenues associated with these services represent £5.5 billion, or 23% of BT's revenues. And moving to the next box in the timeline, in 2016, we reached a great achievement. We met our science-based target to reduce the carbon emissions intensity of our business by 80%, 4 years ahead of schedule. So following on to that, I was coming back from my first COP in Paris and thinking about what had just happened there and what would a company like BT need to do to continue to be a climate leader. And to me, it was obvious that we needed to set a 1.5 degree aligned target. So we did that in September 2017. That target means that we need to reduce the carbon emissions intensity of our business by another 87% by 2030. And I'm also very proud that we have pledged to become a net zero emissions business by 2045. If we go to the next slide, please, Andy. So why do I keep talking about targets? I think targets have been very important in changing behavior within BT. You know, when our CEO stands up and says publicly, we have these targets, that galvanizes the business, that leads to innovation. So, for example, through our energy efficiency programs, we've saved almost £300 million over the past decade. It's also important in terms of sending market signals. So, you know, when BT says we have these decarbonisation targets, we're looking for innovation, I think that spurs innovation within other sectors. So to us, setting targets has been hugely important. If we go to the next slide, please. Just a bit about the Science Based Target Initiative process. Just to say, put this in context, right? So we set this target back in 2017. We were the third company in the world to announce a 1.5 degree aligned science-based targets. So obviously a lot has happened since then. We found that setting the scope 1 and 2 a target was straightforward. You follow the science. We worked with the Carbon Trust and with Andy to figure out a model and a pathway for BT, because of course, when we set this was before the 1.5 degree IPCC report. Setting the scope 3 target proved a bit more challenging because there was no clear guidance, no clear benchmarks, and when we looked at some of the previous targets that had been approved, it seemed that we couldn't follow the same path. So it seemed some companies had very ambitious targets and perhaps others did not. And for us, we were told we had to set an absolute reduction target. So in the end, we did. At the time for us, it was also quite challenging with different time zones and working with a Science-Based Targets Initiative only through email. Would say we were heavily reliant on the Carbon Trust. And again, thank you, Andy and the team, for helping us do the modeling, for helping us fill out the forms and the questionnaires and answering any questions. But with the caveat that I think that has changed quite a bit since. There's a lot more guidance. I think the forms have changed, and as part of this process, we've all learned a lot more about what it's like to set science-based targets. So if we go to the next slide, please. Just wanted to just say, so when we look at our net zero target, what is it that we're going to have to do to achieve that? Firstly, we're going to have to complete the switch to renewable electricity. 100% of the electricity that BT purchases directly from energy providers in the UK is renewable, but we're only at 87% worldwide. There are some challenging markets there. We need to look at various options of what we can do. We have the UK's second largest fleet with about 32,000 vehicles together with Openreach. We need to decarbonise that fleet, and of course to do that we're reliant on government policy in terms of incentives, innovation, a nationwide electric infrastructure charging point network. And we also need to have cost-effective solutions to decarbonise the heating of our buildings. So if we go to the next slide, please. Just very quickly, a big focus for us is looking at how we reduce the carbon emissions associated with our supply chain. We have about 16,000 direct suppliers, and we do that through working with CDP on disclosure. We found that just by asking suppliers to disclose to CDP, they start thinking about carbon reduction and climate action. We're introducing a new contract clause whereby we ask suppliers to reduce their carbon emissions over the term of the contract with BT. This is quite a powerful instrument because as we're negotiating some very large contracts with suppliers, we can say, well, actually, by the way, we have this new contract clause as well, which we would like you to take on. And that means that climate action and carbon reduction comes on a business agenda. So it's not just the sustainability team talking to another sustainability team. It's actually part of the commercial agenda and commercial review. We're also talking to suppliers about purchasing of renewables and setting net zero targets. Collaboration on innovation is very important. We run something we call the BT Game Changing Challenge, where we invite suppliers to come in and pitch their sustainability ideas. And we've seen some big changes in how that has driven change in how our products, what our products look like, because we don't manufacture our own products. Suppliers thinking about logistics and how they can improve that, and also in terms of packaging, for example. So just the next slide, please. I just wanted to show this slide because the work that we do in this space is actually quite important, becoming more important to investors, to our customers, to suppliers, and also to our employees. You know, when our employees see what we do, the recognition that we gain, it's a source of pride for our employees. So I don't think we should forget about that. And I think as we look to recruit, it's something that we get asked about more frequently. So I think my final slide. Around collaboration. So open sourcing and collaboration throughout this journey has been key for us. So, for example, we every year update and publish our 3-to-1 methodology, working with the Carbon Trust. We publish all our carbon accounts in Excel sheets as they just are, and we find that through doing that, we're learning from others and leading by example and sharing best practice, hopefully inspiring others to act as well. And I think coming together in initiatives like the Business Ambition for 1.5 degrees, Science-Based Targets Initiative, We Mean Business, I think that has helped to send demand signals to drive innovation, for example, in renewables, in EVs, and it's just really made us move a lot faster in this space, and how, as more companies join, as we saw before, the Science-Based Targets Initiative, it becomes kind of a hygiene factor and recognized as something that companies should be doing. Ambition loops, just working with policymakers and companies, them seeing companies set ambitions, I think kind of spurs them on to be ambitious as well. And that in turn gives confidence to companies like BT to be even more ambitious in this space. So sorry, that was a bit of a whirlwind tour of what we've done at BT, but thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Gabrielle. And just sort of conclude, so the key points, I guess, takeaway points is that this is increasingly important, and we're seeing more and more ICT companies setting science-based targets, and in particular aligning with the more ambitious 1.5 degree pathway. And for most IT companies, it's likely that you will need to set a scope 3 target, with the two most significant categories being purchased goods and services and use of sold products. And the sector-specific guidance is available. It was published in February 2020, and also, as I mentioned, the GSMA have a how-to, a step-by-step guide that they also published at the same time. And sort of reinforce Gabrielle's sort of final message there, that collaboration is really important within the industry. The ICT sector approach was done through a collaborative approach through 3 organizations representing hundreds of IT companies throughout the world. So thank you, and now I'll hand over to Amy to any final remarks.
Great, thank you. I think we've got a couple of questions that have come in that we have time to go through. So if you have any questions that you've not yet answered, then type into the questions box on the right-hand side, and we will get through as many of these as possible in the remaining 8 or so minutes. So the first question I'm going to direct to Andy at the Carbon Trust and also Alex from the SBTI, if you want to put any insights in here. There's been no reference to IT services companies such as consulting and system integrators. Which approach do you recommend that these service companies should use to set SBT?
Yeah, that's a very good question. It's been a challenge for IT companies sort of prior to this sector guidance as to which sort of category do they fit into. And as I mentioned earlier, so IT covers a whole host of different areas, and sort of service companies might fit into one of, they're certainly not generally operators. Some of them may have their own sort of data centers, but that would be probably a minor part of their business. So it's probably more fit in with the sort of general service sector, I think, rather than use the ICT specific, which is more about hardware and operations. But Alex, I'd also be interested in your views on that.
Yeah, I think the interesting angle here is that a lot of the emissions that perhaps could be considered within the wider value chain of an IT services company won't necessarily show up in their Scope 3 inventory. So they would look from a greenhouse gas accounting view like pretty much any other professional services company. Mm-hmm. So most of those companies would typically choose to use an absolute contraction approach for the Scope 1 and 2 emissions, which essentially means looking at your baseline absolute emissions and then decreasing those in line with the decarbonization rate that we need to see globally. So it wouldn't necessarily be sector specific. And to be honest, the majority of companies under the SBTI have chosen such an approach. And then for Scope 3, it really will depend a lot on the specifics of the company. There is a number of different routes to take, and that's perhaps a bit more complex of a question. But there is certainly a number of different services companies that have set targets. Accenture, for example, Accenture being an example of a large IT service company that has set these targets.
Great, thank you. We've got a question now for Gabrielle from BT. So I think your case study was really insightful, and I think you're very much seen as a leader in the sector. But I think there's some questions that have come around. How did you build the business case internally? Who were the key stakeholders that you got on board, and how did you engage with them on your journey?
Yeah, no, sure. So Andy and I spent quite a bit of time, I would say, working on the modeling and the business case. And I think one of the big challenges in setting the science-based targets was around all the uncertainty. Because, you know, I went to my exco and I said, okay, this is what we want to do. And they said, well, So how much do we need to invest in decarbonizing our fleet? And that's what is going to cost us. And of course, we didn't have an answer to that, really, if I'm honest, because, you know, actually, and today, a few years later, we still are not quite sure about availability of electric vehicles and their costs. So a few things that were helpful to me in getting this through. One was the fact that we had met our previous science-based target 4 years ahead of time, even though we didn't know quite how we were going to do it. Second one was around the cost savings that we had seen through energy efficiency, also through innovation that we had just seen. But a final thought on that, I think I went back to my exco in September of last year, just with an update around this whole area. And I think, you know, in the past 2 years, because of the climate strikes, because of Extinction Rebellion, because of climate change, David Attenborough, all the things that we have seen change in public perception, means that I think excos and CEOs are now much more likely to understand why this is very important. You just need to point to, you know, what's happening out there in the world and where's the public going on this. And we've seen so much more media attention and mainstream media like the BBC start talking about that. So I think that has been really helpful as well. It just becomes something like, okay, if we want to be a leading company or any company, we really need to do this.
That's great. Thanks, Gabrielle. We've had a question come in for Amy, which is around a bit more detail around the business ambition for 1.5 campaign. So I'm wondering, Amy, if you could answer, how can signing up to the business ambition for 1.5 degrees benefit a company who is setting science-based targets?
Thanks, Maddie. Well, I think along with the benefits of setting a science-based target that have been mentioned earlier, and throughout this presentation around resilience, reputation, driving innovation, and the economic benefits, by signing up to the business ambition for 1.5, you'll be joining a global movement of leading companies who are recognizing the urgency of the climate crisis and are aligning their business with that ambitious aim of the Paris Agreement. And by joining that global movement, your company is going to be recognized for the commitment. And I think, as Gabrielle touched on in her presentation, if more companies sign up, you know, there's a lot of collaboration, it will build momentum on corporate climate action, which will send an important market signal for industries to align with a net zero future, and for governments to set up supportive policies as well.
That's great. Thanks, Amy. So we're coming up to 11 o'clock, which is the end of the webinar. So I would just like to ask all of our speakers today just one final question, which is, what would be your key piece of advice to attendees today within the IT sector looking to set their own targets? So Amy, if we want to start with you, if you want to give your kind of final key piece of advice or next steps for the attendees today.
Sure. I think, you know, go for the 1.5 target. This is where you're going to reap the most benefits, and this is where you can go to senior leadership and actually make the business case. So yeah, go for that 1.5 target.
Thanks. And Gabrielle?
Yeah, I think similar to what Amy has said. I think, you know, one of the reasons why we've linked our targets to science is that it was quite easy just to kind of make up targets that kind of sounded good and kind of rhymed. So 20% reduction by 2020, 50% by 2050, but actually linking it to the science made the explanation to the board a lot easier. Like, why did you pick 87%? Because that's what the science says. And I think having the Science-Based Targets Initiative and all these companies signing up is a really strong piece of advice to follow.
Great, thank you. And Alex from SBTI?
I mean, really just thank you for organizing the webinar and kind of bringing the message to the individual companies. I think there's a lot more that we have in terms of support that we didn't cover today. For example, if you're an SME, then there is a new simplified route for SMEs to set science-based targets. As Gabrielle mentioned, a lot of the pain points that existed early in the process have been eliminated, so it's a lot smoother of a journey, even for non-SME companies. So really would just kind of encourage you to get in touch with us, and we'd be very happy to guide you through the steps of setting a science-based target.
Great, thanks. And finally, Andy from the Carbon Trust.
Yeah, I mean, I just so actually reiterate quite a few of those points. So definitely go for 1.5 degrees. And the key thing is keep in mind why you're doing this. So the overall objective is to reduce carbon emissions, and sometimes getting caught up in the detail of the analysis and the scope 3 calculations and what approach to use and the calculations for the targets, it's easy to lose sight of what the overall objective is. And as Gabrielle pointed out, that it really does help drive ambition and action within the company. So there's some necessary work that needs to be done, but always keep in mind sort of what's the strategy to reduce emissions and why you're setting the carbon reduction targets, and to keep that approach sort of as simple as you can.
Great, thank you. So I'm now going to hand back to Amy from the UN Global Compact Network UK to do our closing remarks.
Thanks, Maddie. And thank you everyone for joining today's webinar. Really appreciate you giving your time this morning to learn more about this important agenda. And I hope you feel encouraged to look further into setting science-based targets for your company. So I'd like to thank our presenters, Andy, Gabrielle, Alexander, for your very informative presentations. This webinar has been recorded, so it will be sent to you in a follow-up email. And if your question hasn't been answered during this webinar, then we will try and follow up with you as well to answer anything that you have. And if you do have any more questions, then please do get in contact with either Andy or myself. So thank you much on behalf of the UN Global Compact and the Carbon Trust, and we look forward to working with you on SBTs going forward.